Some families bury their dead. The Halberts made a covenant to keep theirs alive, through rituals, silence, and a refusal to let go. But when I inherited their decaying estate, I discovered something far worse than ghosts, names that had been erased, graves that were never filled, and a house that remembered everything, even what the world tried to forget. What would you do if the price of memory was your sanity? I thought I was simply inheriting an old house when the letter arrived. 5 single-spaced pages of legal name, property boundaries, and a gentle declaration that the Halbert estate was finally, irrevocably mine. But I was wrong, because what I inherited was not wood or wallpaper or fading portraits, but silence. And not just any silence, but silence with voice as heavy as grief, that pressed against every shuttered window and dust-eaten curtain the moment I stepped out of my car and looked up at the house's tall, narrow facade. It's the kind of property a writer dreams of, secluded, untouched, full of possibility, but only for a minute, until you realize it isn't untouched at all. It has been carefully preserved, like a museum of memories someone didn't want lost. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked the long driveway, bordered by overgrown lilac bushes, their petals long wilted, their stems gnarled with age. Each step carried me deeper into a story I didn't know I was joining. The front lawn was littered with neglected toys, rusty wagon wheels, an old rocking horse, doll parts, scattered as if children had stepped away for a moment and never returned. My heart clenched. I held my breath, half expecting a child to emerge at any second, to ask me who I was. But no one did. No one came. And I realized the silence was not silence at all. It was absence, a void filled with unspoken names. Inside, the air was thick and unmoving, as if it had been left unchanged for years. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that slipped through a high-set window in the foyer, and the floorboards muttered beneath my feet as I passed faded portraits lining the walls. Men and women with somber expressions, all wearing the same long skirts and stiff collars, eyes dark, accusing. 3 of them held infants so old their faces are erased. Even in the photo, just blank ovals. Did the Halberts never bury their dead? I asked the air, but all it gave was hush. I followed the grand staircase upward, missing a step, and each board groaned under my weight, as though warning me, guarding me. When I reached the top floor, the hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with closed doors and the smell of old wood and colder things. A child's lullaby, a single note from a music box, echoed through the hallway, but I couldn't find its source. The house wasn't abandoned. It was paused. Each room I opened revealed the same tableau. Untouched beds, folded linens, old toys tucked in the corners, and a photograph on each mantelpiece. I picked up one of a woman, holding a baby with wide, frightened eyes, her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I looked harder. Was that fear in the child's face? Another photo showed the same house, but window panes boarded from the inside, trees in silhouette behind it, branches shaped like hands reaching out. The sun was setting in that image, or was it rising? I couldn't tell. I put the photos back slowly as though I'd been holding nails. IT took hours. Once I broke into my initial awe, to realize the second-floor bedrooms all had nameplates above their doors. Estelle Thomas, Lydia. Family members? Or memories? And upstairs at the very end was a smaller room. The only door locked, its handle stiff with rust. The only doorknob in the house. I pressed my ear to it and heard it. The dull scrape, as if something brushed against the other side. I don't know how long I stood there before I pulled out the rusted key inside a jewelry box found in my pocket, like a message from someone or something, and turned it with a click that echoed in the silent house. The door yielded to reveal a room smaller than the rest, containing a single wooden cradle, covered in dust, embroidered with crosses, and inside lay a tiny dress, white except for stain that had darkened the hem and smelled strange and impossible to place. And there, scrawled on the wall behind the cradle in charcoal or blood, I couldn't be sure, were names, dozens of them, one below the other, bleeding down the plaster like memory made physical. Each name familiar yet distant. Halbert, Taylor, Youngblood, and below them, in a smaller script barely distinguishable. We never laid them down, and I backed away, hands shaking, and the door shut itself behind me with a soft thud that reverberated in my chest, sealing in 100 voices whose names I didn't yet know. But from that moment, I realized this inheritance didn't come with land or logs or history. It came with a duty to remember, and in that heavy hush, I made a promise. I would answer every unspoken name, open every locked door, and give rest, finally, to those who were never allowed to lie down. The Halbert estate had claimed me not because it needed an owner, but because it needed a witness. And so here I stand, at the beginning of a story I didn't choose, walking into a house built on graves with no bodies, into a past that refuses to be buried, and asking, for the first time, who deserves to rest, and who will remain restless until their name is spoken. That I stepped carefully to the threshold of the locked room, cradle dust lifting into motes in the dim light, and as the door clicked shut behind me, I sensed that I had crossed into the heart of something long unsaid, a space where time itself had conspired to hold its breath, and I realized then that every room in this house was a repository of moments that had never been released, moments paused in dust, in photographs, in half-spoken names, and I began my deliberate exploration outward again, but no longer as an owner surveying a property, but as a griever seeking remnants of lives that had been interrupted, stolen, or simply never allowed to rest. I moved to the parlor, where curtains remained drawn though the afternoon sun seeped in around the edges, illuminating antique chairs with upholstery patterned in closed lilies, and I found a slip of paper tucked between one chair cushion seam, a letter truncated halfway down the page, each line washed out as if someone began to cry while writing, words trailing into smeared ink, the last visible fragment reading, "We couldn't give them tombs. We couldn't, but I promise I will hold their names." My throat tightened, and I pressed my fingers gently to the fibers of the cushion, as though touching a pulse, and then I moved on to the library, where rows of leather-bound books stood like sentinels, and I pulled one titled Chronicles of the Valley, only to find a family photograph pressed between pages, a couple with 6 children, faces solemn, standing before the very locked door I'd opened, each child's eyes turned inward, not at the camera, but at something beyond it, as though they already knew what awaited them. I moved through the hallway again, pausing at each closed door until I realized one. The northeast bedroom was just slightly ajar, unlike the rest. I pushed it open to discover a small desk, atop which lay journals in soft leather, one bearing the name Miriam Halbert in careful script. I opened it gingerly and began reading entries that started with mundane routines. Washed the curtains, counted the buttons, sang to the baby at dusk, and gradually shifted into whispered fear. I hear them at night, asking for names. I fear the house listens. I don't want to forget, even as I feel myself slipping, and I found my vision blurring with tears, not just for the writer, but for the weight of memory too vivid for one person, and I realized the Halbert house was not merely old. It was alive in its ache, in its refusal to let time flow, and each journal I uncovered added another layer. Letters from a priest urging burial to bring peace, replies from a mother insisting that to bury would be to forget, recipe notebooks stained with tears, postcards addressed but never mailed, corners folded into prayer shapes, and the upstairs walk-in closet held dozens of locket frames containing faded photos of infants with tape over their eyes, and under each was scrawled a date of birth and no date of death, a detail I couldn't shake, because death had come but documentation had not, and I felt my own chest grow tight as I realized how personal it all was. You could sense the Halbert family still lived here in spirit, tethered to their own unresolved mourning, unable to step forward until every unspoken name was returned to memory, and as dusk fell and the house sank into shadows, I lit a single candle in Miriam's desk, its flame trembling, and I whispered lines I'd read, hoping to give them voice, and I heard a soft echo behind me, like the rustle of clothing or a footfall, though I knew, instinctively, it wasn't a stranger, but the imprint of a grief-requiring witness. A presence bore the house's need to be acknowledged, and I shivered, not from cold, but from knowing that standing in this space, I wasn't just speaking into empty air. I was responding to a centuries-old plea from voices cut short, stew of love and loss, duty and denial, and I understood that this house was built on unburied time, that its walls were steeped in paused moments refusing to be released, and each name across the wood grain and plaster held a right to be remembered, to be spelled aloud, to be freed from absence, And so I stayed there in the candlelight, reading, entry after entry, until the pages blurred and the flame guttered, and when I finally stepped out into the hallway, I was no longer an inheritor. I was a vessel for their remnant, and I knew with a deep, sorrowful certainty that there would be no moving forward until I had granted them the rest they could never know on their own, and the house, with all its hush and its ache, seemed to exhale in that moment, as if waiting for me to carry their stories into tomorrow. I drove into town in the pale morning light, the Halbert house shrinking into the rearview mirror, but its weight still tightening inside me, and I couldn't shake the sense that I carried something too heavy for an empty seat beside me. My destination was a county records office, a stone building in the center of the deserted square, its windows dark and bureaucratic, and when I asked the clerk for death records for the Halbert family, Eliza Halbert, born 1863, Tobias Halbert, born 1889, Miriam Halbert, born 1912, even. Their children born and vanished before the gravestone blankness of their cemetery. She paused so long I thought I'd ask for something taboo, and when she finally slid back a ledger saying, "Nothing," flat and cool, I felt a cold buzz at the base of my skull, like something I buried too deep had just broken surface. I asked for death certificates, burial permits, cemetery records, anything, she said, but there was nothing, no paper trail to kin or remains, no indication they ever died. Even though the house bore every other stamp of time, the telephone books listed the Halbert estate as a landmark, and the yellowed newspapers in the archive had front-page articles about a fire on their land in 1923 and obituaries for unknown infant discovered in the home's east wing. But Halbert was never in any column. I pressed her. Surely someone had to have registered a body, a burial, a death, and she studied me as though afraid I might break, and said, "Perhaps records were lost." But when I asked specifics, she said, "It's been a long time," and looked away, the ledger still open between us. I left with nothing but more questions in a dossier that included no one's death, and as I walked past the vacant storefronts in the old church with its peeling paint, I felt eyes on me, the whole town leaning back into its seat, while I rattled at the door they all agreed should stay closed. That afternoon I visited the local funeral home, door half-latched as if ready to be closed, against me, and asked the undertaker's granddaughter if she had archives. She nodded slowly, leaning in as though sharing something forbidden, saying, "We buried something once, we were paid to bury it," but there was no name. And when I asked whose body it had been, she swallowed hard and said, "We did as asked and moved on." My stomach turned. I realized then that this wasn't merely historical error. It was active erasure. Even the youngest local seemed to hold that silence as inheritance. That night I walked past the cemetery again, headstones pale against the moon, and the dirt beneath them was undisturbed, solid, as though a barrier existed between hope and soil, between body and rest. I knelt in grass, fingertips ghosting over letters that weren't my name and weren't theirs, and murmured, "Tell me why you still wait." But the ground said nothing, only cold. I realized silence wasn't innocence here. It was a vow, an insurance, and whoever held it had decided long ago that to speak would fracture something too fragile. And as I felt that silence coiled tighter around the town, pressing into the thin walls of my car, I understood that the Halbert names existed only in whisper and memory and unfiled grief, and now I was going to give them what they had been denied. Recognition, record, ritual, and perhaps, finally, the right to rest. When I realized the diary and journals weren't the only documents in this house, I returned to the parlor, to the chest of drawers I had left untouched days earlier. Its wood, polished yet eroded in places, as though memory had worn it down. And that's when I found it. A ledger hidden beneath a false bottom, bound in red leather cracked across its spine, each page edged in gold. The name Halbert, ritual and record, was stamped in smudged ink on the cover, and I recognized in that moment the gravity of what lay before me. This was no financial account, no family budget. It was an archive of sorrow, a ledger of love twisted by grief and fear and ritual, and I sat on the floor and opened it, dread slithering down my spine, because the pages were full of entries I'd only glimpsed in half-imagined nightmares. The first page I read bore a date, June 1st, 1891, and beneath it, in a careful feminine script, "Mother Elisa brings Rebecca, 9 months yesterday. Her mother gone but never absent, laid by hearth, learned the holding song." And as I kept reading entry after entry, I saw the pattern, births, deaths, though no death certificates, and beside them ritual instructions. At moonrise bury no bones, leave marrow in a dish, cover with salt, or asterisk, write name 4 times on cloth and burn at dawn. Instructions for shadow binding, midnight lull, name, tether, harvest, a breath. Terms I'd never heard but which filled me with a sick sensation that printed words could twist around the heart and squeeze it dry. And as I turned page after page, I watched the ledger become darker. October 12th, 1903. Tobias wept at the well as we washed his robes. He said he could feel her walking. We summoned the quiet tonight. It remained. After that, the entries grew shorter, more desperate. Bow and hold failed. She left again. Others filled whole pages with coordinates. Graveside, 3rd oak from border, hold towel teeth, breathe 3 times. Voice unbinds. And I understood the ledger wasn't a record of failure, because they lacked ritual. It was a record of ritual because they feared forgetting would tear them apart. The final pages were the most distressing. Dated 1935, the handwriting fractured. Names spoken nightly. If silence holds too long, we burn the names in the hearth. Confession of forgetting aloud. 2 lanterns at past start. No driftwood. And then at the very last page, there was a 3-line confession, scratched as though the writer was in tears. We cannot hold them here forever. Every time we perform the ritual, part of us drifts instead. They are not rested. We are not whole. Forgive us. My breath caught. The ledger admitted defeat. Not just loss of life, but loss of meaning. Ritual designed to anchor the dead in presence had anchored the living to a ceaseless loop of grief and failure. And reading it, I felt the ledger's weight descend on me, its burden of remembrance, the need to honor names even when the family gave up trying, convinced that silence or ritual could defeat absence, both of which had clearly been lies, because presence isn't memory and memory isn't rest. I closed the book, my hands trembling, realizing the Halbert house had trapped itself, and now me, in a web of ceremony and sorrow. In the page margins were smudged thumbprints and drops of liquid, stains that looked like dried blood or tears. I understood then that their grief had bled onto the pages, and now I carried that grief. I understood why the records office had no death certificates, why the town refused to speak their names, why the cemetery held empty graves. They weren't hiding records. They were hiding failure, shame, the guilt of knowing they couldn't keep the dead near without destroying themselves. And as I pressed my forehead to the mantle above the ledger drawer, I whispered the name Miriam, and the ledger seemed to hum, as though the house recognized that someone finally spoke truth aloud. The ledger was more than paper. It was the last voice of family who sought to defy death not by killing memory, but by refusing to bury loss. And in that refusal they died a little, generation after generation, until the house itself had become a shrine of halted sorrow. I closed the drawer carefully, but I didn't leave. I stayed in that room until the sun dipped low, reading dates and repeating names. Elisa, Tobias, Miriam, Rebecca, and others I didn't know, because their names were burned off the page. And in that house of unburied time, listening to the walls breathe around me, I made a vow. I would not become the next entry. I would carry their names into tomorrow, but I would not tether myself to ritual. I would not bind. I would not burn. I would let them rest. And with that promise unspoken, I stood, ledger in hand, moving into the hallway that held the hollow cradle room, aware more than ever that this house was plotting to hold me, to make me feel the failing of ritual, the agony of remembering without rest. And I had to choose differently, or risk becoming the next soul trapped in its ledger of loss, that I approached the graveyard behind the Halbert estate at dawn, when the mist still lingered between crooked headstones and the world felt too quiet for. Someone had slept through last night's secrets, and as I stepped off the chipped stone pathway into the long grass that curled over every grave, I felt as though I were crossing the threshold into memory itself. Not the memory recorded in paper, but the memory sedimented in earth, in something deeper and more tangled than documentation. And I knelt beside the first headstone, carved simply Elisa Halbert, without date or epitaph, and drew a finger through the moss that had grown into letters, revealing fresh soil beneath, and that fresh soil was undisturbed, smooth, firm, without depression or mound, and I ran the back of my hand over ground, feeling nothing but the cold assertion of suffocation, of absence, and I realized something unthinkable. There had been no burial. Not here. Not for anyone. I looked at the neighboring stones. Miriam Halbert, Rebecca Halbert, Tobias Halbert, infant Ella, and each one carried that same flat, unbroken silence of the earth, as though no coffin, no body had ever passed through the soil of this place, and I staggered to my feet, heart slamming against ribs, realizing that the ledger's rituals, the journal's confessions, the hollow statements of the local records, they were all smoke and mirror, because the real truth had been buried in something else entirely, hidden by earth that never accepted bodies, depths that never held remains, a promise half-kept, a facade of mourning that left everything unfinalized, unresolved, and I felt my breath shudder in my throat as I moved from stone to stone, quickly brushing each one, searching for a seam, a patch of shifted ground, a sign of disturbance. But there were none, only solid earth so unyielding it felt like denial encoded in dirt, and my knees buckled when I reached the smallest stone, labeled unborn child, with no name, and I pressed my palm there, feeling the cold, slender horizon of unknowing, and at that moment, the fog lifted as if someone had drawn a curtain. The ledger rituals weren't meant to hold the dead. It was to mimic burial, to simulate closure, to seal memory above ground while leaving bodies unclaimed, unblessed, unrested. And I understood with sudden clarity that the Halberts never meant to bury. They meant to suspend. They planted markers in place of graves, used soil as a stage set, and believed that if they built enough ritual, performed enough ceremonies, the dead would forgive them for never letting go. And the way the lids of graves never sank was both metaphor and design, a refusal of decay and a deferral of mourning, but also a lie so thick I could feel it under my fingernails, and I realized with bitter clarity that those names on the stones belonged not to bodies that slept beneath them, but to memories they refused to relinquish, to actions they feared would erase them completely if they stopped pretending to bury, even when there was nothing to bury. And I stepped away from the plot of stones and walked along the edge where ground met stones, where grass met granite, feeling the uncanny hum of untouched earth, listening for collapse that would never come, and tears leaked down my cheeks not because I felt sorrow for the dead, but because I felt horror for the living who live with that level of denial, who think ritual can replace rest. And I stayed there, among empty graves, until the sun broke the mist and cast a pale light across the land, and I whispered, "You deserve ground." And I realized then that my voice, my presence here, was now part of an unfinished legacy, that the stones had been waiting for someone to say their names and ask where their bodies lay, and that the act of standing here in that eerie, unsinking graveyard was a confession itself, a reckoning that claiming inheritance meant not just claiming land, but claiming guilt, silence, failure, and the obligation to finally, truly lay them to rest. And as I walked back to the house, the ground behind me made no sound, no acknowledgement, just a persistent, unbroken hold. As though daring me to break it, I realized I was standing in front of them before I understood why their faces felt both unfamiliar and achingly known. Portraits lined against the attic wall beneath a single, naked bulb, leaning from old wooden planks nailed into rafters, each depicting a figure dressed in faded formal wear, their eyes caught in that moment of artificial stillness. But I couldn't place them, not until I traced the curves of their lips or the lines around their eyes and felt some old ache, like meeting a stranger who carries your unfinished dreams inside their gaze. Behind each frame, a name tag hand-etched into the wood, names like Henry Marlowe, 1915, Clara Winsome, 1921, Thomas Kendall, 1909, none of them Halbert, none of them listed in any public genealogy or family archive I'd searched, but their presence here, arranged in numbered order from 1 to 36, made it clear they were integral to the house's memory, to its unspoken ledger of loss, as crucial as Elisa or Tobias. And when I stepped closer, I noticed they were placed in chronological grouping, but also by facial composition. The way their eyes followed me from the corner of the roof or the bare plank, their gazes seeming to shift as I circled, and the attic space narrowed my breaths, each inhalation bringing in the musk of old wood, and something darker, like exhaled regrets locked behind the rafters. I leaned in, closer to the nearest one, Mary Caldwell, 1895, and I could swear I knew that face, had glimpsed in the reflection years ago or in my dreams, and the more I studied, the more I realized I remembered something I couldn't name, as though the house had loaned me memories to confirm their presence, a trick of familiarity that unnerved me deeper than any unlocked door. At the far end of the wall, A portrait in a cracked frame showed a young child, portrait soft with age but unmistakably alive in innocence, smiling, hair in ringlets, wearing a dress blackened at the edges. The name card behind read Etta Halbert, 1928, and beside it another, Infant Halbert, unnamed 1933, which gave me chills because I had seen those dates in Miriam's ledger, mourning a child whose name had been erased by ritual, and I staggered backwards, heart pounding, struggling to reconcile that this house had not only rewound history, but patched in missing names from outside. Names that held sway here, but nowhere else. And behind me, boards creaked with subtle intimation, the house adjusting its spine to hold me, and I found myself speaking aloud, fumbling for explanation in the musty attic air. Who are you? Why are you in this? But only silence came, as thick and suffocating as will blanket, and I felt the weight of transfer. Their stories held here, their names tethered without record, suspended as the Halberts had done to their kin, and the symmetry felt too deliberate to be accident. I realized that the family had been collecting souls, names, faces, extracting memory out of existence, and giving it sanctuary behind planks and nails, instead of letting those souls lie or pass on and through. They had found witness again. Even I, with no birthright, had somehow become part of their twisted familial mandate, to witness absence. My breath shook as I studied list after nameless face. Josephine Alder, 1892, Caleb Kent, 1900, Dawson White, 1918, none Halbert, and I realized that these were not hidden Halberts, but people whose names had been lost or stolen. Maybe they worked on the estate. Maybe they died there. Maybe they hadn't belonged. But here their names were kept, their faces pressed into plaster air, in silent testimony, buried into the house's psyche in place of documentation. And the deeper I stared, the more my own reflection blurred in the glass, as though the house was asking me to join that lineup, to lean in and let my face be trapped in dusty memory. I felt a tear slip down my cheek and wiped it on my sleeves. This was no longer murder of absence. It was erasure through preservation. They weren't gone. They'd been preserved, hidden in plain sight, nameless but never forgotten by the house. My fingers itched to touch the frames, to run along the names, to say them, to anchor them. And as I did, I heard, faintly, a voice so soft I thought it was a house exhaling. They remember. And I realized in that moment that the ledger, the cemetery, the rituals, they were all facets of the same desperate need. To keep everyone who died in or around this place from truly vanishing, no matter who they were. I pictured the Halberts recording a ledger of people they claimed, circumventing death by naming souls, adding faces to the boundary of their grief. And I felt my own grief for names that I would never know yet felt tied to. The attic door groaned, warning me away, but I stayed, collecting names inside my lungs. And when I descended the stairs, I carried 36 faces in my mind, silent companions whose stories had nowhere else to go but through me. I found her diary in the drawer of a battered wooden desk tucked into the back of the attic under low rafters. The cover was soft leather, faded pink, its edges worn, and in sweet, loopy handwriting were scrawled the words Etta's thoughts. And as I opened the first page, I expected childish narratives of petals, school days, and sibling pranks. But no, what poured out was innocence spiraling into something darker, her voice fragile and candid, and I began to read. Mama sings to me when I wake, low like the wind that doesn't bring birds. She says I am safe, but Daddy tells me not to listen to things that talk from the walls. My throat clenched with chill, because though written in a girl's hand, the words were suffused with adult dread, a fear beyond her years. I read on. Thomas lost his doll again. I found it under the bed, but its eyes were gone. I sewed in new ones at night. I told him it was okay. A tear fell and blotted the ink. I blinked it away and kept going because Etta woke too early the next day. I walked down the hall when the floorboard hummed like someone was singing my name. I stopped at the door at the end and heard a lullaby I didn't know. It felt empty. I paused, breath catching, the nostalgia of childhood unraveling into mistrust. What lullaby did a door sing? She continued. Mama said that lullaby is for the quiet ones who miss their numbers at the registry. She sang it loud so they might return. My hand shook. Numbers at the registry, like numbered faces, numbered pages in the ledger, numbered graves? The more I read, the heavier the words became. We had a party once for the quiet ones. We laid out their clothes on chairs. They never came. I shook, breath ragged. Chairs and rooms, clothes laid out. It matched the sealed bedroom with the made bed and garments ready. Every night Mama lights candles and prays they remember home. I realize these were acts of remembrance masquerading as ritual, but I am afraid that one day the chairs will stay empty forever and we will sleep alone. The diary turned brittle with sorrow. We buried Thomas by the oak tree, but then he ran back inside crying. Daddy said the oak doesn't keep him. We brought him back inside. My pulse pounded. She thought bodies and bones could be returned when they weren't resting. When I close my eyes, I hear them underneath, but when I open them, the floor is still there and it doesn't breathe. Beneath, below, something trapped or imagined beneath the boards. I wrote all the names down. Clara, John, Henry, Little Annie. I said them over and over so they wouldn't be lost. They sang back, quiet voices in my ear. My hands trembled. She recorded names and felt voices answering. Last night I forgot one. His name was Edward. Mama found the paper in my pocket and said tomorrow we will say it for him. Tomorrow we say it for him. Ritual continued. Sometimes I don't know if I am saying their names or they're saying mine. I gasp, this child writing fear, empathy, confusion. I wish I never had to say their names. I looked at the dashboard of the diary. The middle was soaked in tears, ink smudged beyond deciphering. But near the end, the writing stopped being full sentences and became lists. Asterisk Anna, Clara, Etta, John, Henry, Edward. Don't forget the quiet ones, Mama said tomorrow. Tonight they come. And the final page was a single line, centered, I won't forget. I promise. Underneath was a smear, a smudge of tears, or something else. Blood? I couldn't tell. I closed the diary and pressed it to my chest until my tears soaked through my shirt. I was living inside her confession. A child-made caretaker the unburied. A surrogate mother to names and memories she couldn't forget. Her words confirmed every whisper, every ledger entry, every lined-up toy and shuttered door. It was more than history. It was testimony from a witness too young to guard secrets, but wise enough to know they had to be spoken. I sat in the attic with her diary for hours, reading and reciting her words aloud, feeling the walls inhale my voice, filling the room with echoes of children I never knew but now could not forget. And when I finally left that attic, the diary in my pack, but my soul hollowed in a way that felt like remembrance, I knew that I was no longer exploring an old house. I was honoring a small child's courage in naming ghosts, trusting that saying names might give them form or rest. The diary of Etta Halbert had given me purpose. To speak what she could not, to free what she held captive in ink. And I understood that the real horror had not been ignorance. It was silence. And silence wasn't rest. It was forgetting. And forgetting would never be allowed again. There's a particular kind of horror in a room frozen in time, where care meets decay in a kind of unholy duet. And when I returned to that attic again, this time following a creak in the hallway floor that only appeared after I'd gone to the portraits in Etta's diary, I found another door I hadn't noticed before, just a panel in the wall. Its edges splintered, and it rattled when I pushed it, as though something inside wanted to stay quiet. So I paused with my hand on the knob and closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of dust and rot that hummed through the boards, then carefully pried it open, revealing a bedroom so small the bed filled most of the floor, a 4-panel canopy stripped of curtains, slats broken and splintered, mattress sagging into a bowl of mold and damp, the wood meeting my gaze with a slick stain of old water, and yet on the edge of that bed, hanging over the footboard, were fresh clothes, folded neatly. A child-sized sweater of robin's egg blue, clean and soft, with buttons that gleamed as though new, and a pair of woolen socks, slightly damp, placed where their heels matched, as if someone had just set them out for a child who was expected but never came, and the juxtaposition stopped me cold. Rot in readiness, memory and anticipation, the decay of the room and the hopeful fold of cloth, as though the Halberts had built this room with one hand, while their other hand tried to keep someone inside, someone who had never left, or who was always supposed to come back. And I pushed further inside, all sound in my head deadened except for my breath whispering against the filthy floorboards, and I knelt beside the bed and ran my fingers along the edge of the mattress, brushing away a patch of mold to reveal tiny embroidered initials. EH, Etta Halbert, just like the attic diary, and I squeeze a fabric, not fully understanding what drive could take someone to dress a room that needed burial, to clothe a corpse without ever letting it mind decay spiraling into mold, until I saw at the bedside table a tarnished silver picture frame, with no image but bearing the inscription, "Return soon, beloved." Return soon, beloved? The words made the air grip between my lungs, cut through the hush with the ache of a beckoning that had been waiting decades to be answered. I stood and examined the floor. Between boards, I saw a small pile of rotted plush, once a stuffed bear, now a lump of felt and straw, pins rusted into its seams, and near the wall lay a cracked porcelain plate with sippy cup, both coated in dust except where a single area had been wiped clean, like someone pressed their hand into the dust the day before, wiping, remembering. And the floorboard beneath the bed, slightly darker, indicated damp, rot, perhaps even a body once, though no wreck existed, and I felt bile rise as reality pressed. The bed had been made for someone who never arrived, yet worn into rot by years. The clothes were fresh. Someone had returned recently, maintained the illusion of care, of welcome, not returning, but tending, as though if the room were clean and the clothes fresh, the child would come home, would emerge from absence. My mind fought between sorrow and revulsion, empathy and terror, and I thought of the ledger rituals. Placing clothes, naming, burning names, counting breath. This was ritual in action, a physical offering in a room of ruin. And then the door behind me creaked again, but lightly, and I whirled around, flashlight trembling, but saw nothing, no person, no breath of movement. Only shadow, damp walls, and the stale scent of memory. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the clean clothes brushing my sleeve, and tears blurred my vision as I realized it didn't matter if the body was gone or never here. The room still consumed its occupant in memory and practice, refused to let them slip from sight, and that was cruelty disguised as devotion. I imagined a child walking into this room each day and seeing the bed made, clothes waiting and thinking, they're coming. They couldn't have gone. And the hate in that, the lie, and on my knees I whispered, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And I removed the clothes, folded them slowly, pressing them to my heart as though to gather the essence of a child they were meant for. Then I placed them back gently as a guardian. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't, not until I understood every inch of that room's devotion and denial. I searched the walls and found scratches, long gouges that coiled in child height, as though someone had scraped at the plaster in anger or longing. I touched them, feeling the grain of wood behind them, the commitment to remain. I stayed until the flashlight died, and I navigated back to the corridor, shutting the door softly but not latching it. The room had done its work. I didn't need silence. Back in the hallway, breathing hard, I realized I wasn't just honoring absence anymore. I was carrying it. That room, the rot, the fresh clothes. It wasn't just a memory ring. It was a trap. And now I was inside it. And I knew I would have to free more than my inheritance. I would have to free my own soul from this devotion to remembrance. But first, I had to leave the clothes where they were, perfectly folded for whoever or whatever, still believed they were waiting. I didn't expect to find it in the dusty folders stacked on the bottom shelf of the funeral home's archive closet. An actual bill dated June 1895, embossed in yellow but intact. Undertaker services rendered. Halbert family. Listing 10 bodies, caskets, earth closing, embalming. Total cost $52.33. A tidy record of finality, written in fading ink. Yet there was no receipt of payment, no ledger marking acceptance, just that crisp promise of service never fulfilled. And when I slid it into my pocket, I felt a gravity settle like lead across my shoulders, because for every cemetery stone, for every ritual, for every ledger entry, there should have been closure in law and in soil, but the bill suggested someone, maybe the Halberts, maybe the town, paid for ceremony, yet never let death complete its course. I pressed the Undertaker's home phone number into my trembling fingers and called, longing for clarity, and a woman answered softly, calling me Miss. Before I could introduce, she sounded tired, her voice like old wool, and when I mentioned the Halbert bill she froze, inhaled sharply, then asked me politely if I'd come to purchase another gray plot, to which I said no. That was about the record, the documents, the unpaid services, asking, do you have any memory, any story? And she hesitated so long, Line hissed his discomfort, then invited me to come by. "There's someone you need to talk to," she said, voice trembling though she didn't know why. And when I arrived hours later at her small home on Main Street, cluttered with flowers and memory jars and framed certificates of community service, I heard her don a coat and sigh before opening the door to reveal her father, name tag reading Walter Green, General Undertaker, family business since 1874. He was stooped, shoulders bent as though, carrying decades of secrets, and when I placed a bill on his desk, his glasses caught the lamp glint and his breath left him. His fingers shook as he traced the embossed cursive reading. I billed them. I noted the graveside service. I listed each Halbert child. And his voice cracked. "I recall preparing those bodies," he whispered, and I pressed still further, asking him to say it. "Did he bury them?" "No," he said, venom in the simple word. He told me that he and his father had driven to the Halbert property one warm morning, coffins loaded into the back of their carriage, hopeful to complete their service, offer closure to grieving parents. Yet when they arrived, the field was empty, no pit dug, no earth turned, and the Halberts met them at the door. Stoic, formal, private. Mr. Tobias said, "We're holding ceremonies here. Outside of that, we don't require disturbance." Mr. Green recalled looking into the box lids and seeing no bodies, only linens, damp but lifeless only in a word, not in presence. And he'd asked where the bodies were, and Tobias said stiffly, "They lie with us." He told me how he filed a bill and left it unsatisfied, how no payment came and no refund, how in town calling on Halbert intent was met with silence. The church refused to accept a funeral rite. The town clerk held the bill but no record. The groundskeeper who dug the empty trenches had taken his secret to the grave, leaving only that bill and a memory of empty earth. And he admitted that at night he'd lie awake, hearing voices out by the property line, singing old dirges, and he'd wept, because there was a service he couldn't finish, a purpose he couldn't complete. I pressed him on why he'd never spoken. The bill was public record until someone had it sealed, locked away in the archive closet, and his daughter nodded, wiping tears silently. He said, "We all agreed it was best left unsaid." The weight of it crushed me, the town, the business of burial itself, complicit in erasure, choosing silence over truth. And when I asked what he thought happened to the Halbert children, he closed his eyes and said, "They were buried among memories." Their bodies were not buried because the Halberts believed telling their names, naming their rituals, build a place where they remained near. But in doing so, they trapped them. His words hung between us like gravestones with no ground. I realized then that everyone had participated. Ledger keepers, ritual performers, undertaker, town clerks, even me in inheriting the land. I had become another link in that chain, each of us silencing death with silence or ceremony, and I asked Mr. Green if he felt guilt. His eyes watered, and he stroked the bill's edge. Every time a bill remains unpaid, a duty remains undone. For a lifetime, I felt I had abandoned them. And I told him, "But now I carry it, and I will finish what you couldn't." He nodded, relief flooding his features as though a confession had freed him in part. Leaving, I carried not just a bill but the weight of complicity, mine and the town's. And as I drove back to Halbert State that night, lantern swinging in the trunk, the ancient bills laying warm against the wood, I realized that unburied bodies aren't just unclaimed. They're demands that someone must finally acknowledge them, record them, close them, give them rest, and that the ledger and diary and empty graves had led me here, to confront a living keeper of death's commerce, to face the failure of ceremony without truth, and to finally say it aloud. The dead were never laid to rest, but they can be vindicated. And I vowed then, to see it done, I found the trapdoor tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen, disguised beneath a patterned rug of muted colors, almost invisible until I pushed aside and felt the hinge groan like a soft moan from the earth itself. And when I descended the narrow stairwell into that forgotten root cellar, my skin prickled with the chill that accompanies secrets too long concealed, for the air was thick and damp, scented with the sour tang of spoiled root vegetables, old stone, and something else, something acrid, closer to memory burning than decay. Yet as my eyes adjusted to the weak light of my flashlight, I saw that this cellar wasn't used for food or fuel. It was storage of another kind, dusty wooden crates stamped with crossed-out names, metal filing cabinets with drawers bent shut, bundles of charred paper tied with string, and on the far wall, hundreds of thin strips of parchment tacked into rows, each inscribed with name, Elisa Halbert, Miriam Halbert, Thomas Halbert, Rebecca Halbert, and interwoven with those, Clara Winsome, Henry, Marlowe Etta Halbert, Edward Caldwell. Names I'd encountered before, each row darker at the top, where ink had run with age and moisture. The lower strips almost faded to white, and I realized that this was an attempt at cataloging memory, but a failing attempt, because the fading names were a slow murder of identity, a drip of erasure and reverse of ritual naming, and I whispered each one aloud as I followed row after row. Names once lit in murals of memory, now dimmed by damp and neglect. I opened a crate to find dozens of baby shoes, some patched, some melted together, each with names scratched inside: Mary, Josephine, Clara. I breathed in on those names as though they were prayers, feeling each syllable press into my lungs, and I found ribbons with dates but no names, photographs torn in half and scribbled over, journals whose covers were burned off, entries truncated with scorched margins, as though someone tried to burn memory itself. On the floor lay overturned metal cabinets, and inside one drawer I discovered a ledger with pages waterlogged and ink bleeding, yet still legible in places: census, style lists of residents with columns for birth date, death date, with death dates left blank or stamped not applicable, and beside many names, a flick of red ink, erased. I pressed my thumb over that word and shivered. Memory had become violence. Deeper in the cellar was a low stone bench, above which hung a single rusted lantern, and below it a basin of water filled to the brim, reflecting the lantern's ghost. I cupped my hand into the water and pulled out a soaked piece of paper with a name, Estelle Halbert, and a note in a terse hand: displaced, moved to December 1945. The notes became more bureaucratic as I navigated deeper crates. Reassign bones to Hall B. Incinerate memory tapes. Whoever kept this cellar wasn't documenting. They were laundering identity, rewriting history to manage the ledger above, and it felt like walking to the reverse of a memory vault. Here were the names that were being fed into oblivion, not preserved with ritual in the ledger, not whispered in diary, but actively erased by bureaucratic action and suffocating humidity. I stood on a stain in the damp floor that looked like a dark footprint, as if someone had stood here, performing erasure, scrubbing names, discarding memory into acid water or incineration, and I thought of the unpaid graves, the unburied bodies, the fresh clothes on rotten bed, and realized that naming was not enough. Sometimes naming must be resisted, because it was used not to preserve but to control, to fold people into schemes of remembrance that ended in erasure. My flashlight trembled as I moved toward a pile of burned ribbons and notes, their words half recognizable: remember, never lay, keep voice alive, crossed out in flame. I gathered a handful and held them. They crumbled like dust between my fingers. I pressed the knee to the cold stone and closed my eyes, imagining the voices whispering as they faded, the ledger voices, the diary voices, the erased voices, each demanding not to vanish entirely. The cellar's darkness seemed to pulse with sorrow, with guilt, with the knowledge that someone in that house thought words and names could be conducted through chambers of erasure to vanish into silence. But memory resists. And I, standing there, became the successor not only to ritual and erasure, but to resurrection, to choose which names would stay, which would go, and protect them from bureaucratic death. I rose and shone my light on the far wall, where water dripped in quiet rhythm, echoing like a pulse. Then I carefully re-tagged several of the legible parchment strips, pressed them flat, and resolved to retrieve what memory I could from the damp and dust, so that names didn't fade again. I closed the trapdoor with the weight of dozens of souls in my arms, and as I climbed into the kitchen, the house creaked around me, as if breathing once more, and I realized I was no longer just an inheritor. I was a restorer, tasked not just to dig graves and read names, but to fight the very entropy of forgetting, because silence can take many forms, and names vanish in the corridor between ritual and documentation, unless someone chooses memory over oblivion. That I found the covenant tucked inside. A long-forgotten bureau drawer, wrapped in oilskin and sealed with darkened wax bearing the Halbert crest, a stylized tree with its roots exposed. And when I broke the seal and unfolded the parchment under the dim glow of my flashlight in the parlor, I realized within moments that this was no simple family will or set of instructions, but blood-bound generational contract, cracked in parts, written in layered hands, each era amending the terms of memory and silence. And it began with Elisa's, Scrawl in 1889. The date nearly illegible from age. We, the bearers of Halbert name, vow to refuse burial as a means of remembrance, to keep our dead within reach rather than surrender them to earth. We believe in the presence of souls held within this roof, within nail and beam. We choose ritual over welfare, voice over void, to ensure no following Halbert is lost to forgetfulness. As I read on, Tobias's additions in 1903, smaller, tremulous handwriting, expanded the terms. We receive bodies, but transform them into soil no. We will not inter them, but hold them above ground within memory's domain. Our rituals are covenant. We accept the failure of finality. Then Miriam's 1935 entry, trembling yet resolute, carved into the parchment's margin. The chairs, the clothes, the ledger, they are requirement. We cannot falter. If we bury, we forget. If we forget, we lose our bond. Instead, this house becomes the archive of presence. A later edition, dated 1962, carried her daughter's handwriting. Fragile loops overlaying faded script. I swear before my mother's name that I will not break this covenant. I will preserve them with naming, ceremony, vigil. Let bones remain in our hands, not in pits. And beneath that, a blank space where it looked like the final generation had been expected to sign, but never did, except a stain like dried blood, or ink bleed that looked like a fingerprint pressed in haste. As I realized the weight of what lay before me, tears blurred the words, but the covenant was absolute. The Halberts had deliberately forged a legacy of ritual preservation over burial, anchored in grief and fear of forgetting, formalized in a contract that passed through hands like inheritance. Not property, but duty. Their vow was to remain as an unbroken line of remembrance that would defy decay. But in doing so, they ensured they would never escape their sorrow. They chose to sacrifice permanence for presence, connection for closure, and that choice meant they would carry every generation's grief forward until someone, someday, broke it. Reading the covenant, I heard the echo of Etta's words. I wish I never had to say their names. And felt the agony of a family bound to an impossible promise, a religion of memory that trapped them in endless witness, unable to bury, unable to release, and I thought of the empty graves, the unidentified photos in the attic, the rotting closed room, the paper-smudged ledger, and it all coalesced. This had not been an accident, a failing. This was their intent. Not burying the dead had been a ritual-laden declaration. We will hold you always. And yet, how hollow that becomes when centuries pass and rituals crumble and the living are hollowed out in their stead. My chest tightened with rage and sorrow. Their covenant had been a theft of rest, a covenant of binding chains rather than freedom. But now that I understood it, I could unmake it. I traced my fingers across the inked names of every Halbert who had signed it, whispering their names aloud. Elisa, Tobias, Miriam, Etta, and I realized that their final unspoken signatory was me, heir by inheritance, witness by discovery, successor their contract. The parchment trembled in my hands as though the covenant recognized its new bearer. I closed my eyes and took a breath so deep my ribs ached and said, I refuse. I made a shaky, deliberate notation beneath the last line. I will honor memory by release. I will bury the Halbert dead. I will sever this covenant. My pen scratched rival blood across the centuries of grief, offering them a final gift, rest. I folded the parchment and tucked it into my coat pocket, knowing it was both confession and decree. And as dawn dawned outside the shuttered windows, light carved dust columns across the floor, and I stood amidst the silent witnesses of a family made holy by memory, undone by choice, and understood that what followed was not just closure for them, but liberation for me. The house seemed to exhale in relief or grief. I couldn't tell, as if its foundations shifted for the first time in 100 years. The covenant had been broken. The Halberts' vigil had ended not in death, but in liberation from it. Now, I would lay them to rest. I began the burial on a cold morning when the earth was still damp with dew and the sky was the color of morning itself, and as I exhumed the small, numbered stones from the Halbert plot behind the house, stones that held no bodies, I carried each one to a time-centered ridge of soil I had prepared at the edge of the old graveyard, where the earth lay rich and honest, and with gloved hands I gently placed the first headstone made hollow by absence onto its rightful resting place, tilting it so that its inscription, Elisa Halbert, welcomed the sunrise rather than sealed her into silence. And as I line up each subsequent grave, Miriam, Tobias, Rebecca, Etta, and the nameless infant, I press my palm onto the cool granite and at my lips spoke a simple phrase, "May you rest at last." Each utterance cracked open decades of unspoken grief, and a wind lifted to the half-wilted grass as though the earth itself exhaled with relief. I dug deeper to carve each casket pit, a proper resting place, and slid into each a clean pine box I had arranged and lined with white linen, and inside I placed a small token, Miriam's brittle leather-bound journal, Etta's diary, baby shoes unearthed from the root cellar, and a few pages of the covenant, now severed from binding. I recovered each casket slowly, whispering the names of the mourners who had joined grief with memory rather than mourning with ritual, and as the sun rose higher, I placed fresh wildflowers on each mound, their colors pale and honest, not ritual offerings, but symbols of release. And I realized in that moment I wasn't laying these people to rest. I was laying a burden down, lifting a family from sorrow's prison, and opening a path for their story to walk free. The ledger and attic faces, the mold-spotted cradle room, and faded pictures, all these fragments came with me here, woven into the soil with dignity instead of shame. As I placed the last flower on Etta's mound, a small note scrawled with my promise, I felt a shift in the morning air, something gentle and unfocused, like the soft echo of children's laughter or names whispered without breath. And I closed my eyes, hand over my heart, sensing that this house was finally breathing properly, no longer consumed by memory's weight, but renewed by closure. Behind me, the cemetery gate that stood rusted and informal was resecured and subtly repaired, not as a barrier to keep out memory, but as a boundary to mark a sacred place, no longer a prison for remnant souls, but a memorial for living grief. The house behind that gate seemed still but open, a sanctuary, not a shrine. I returned inside to collect the documents. The covenant parchment I folded carefully, Miriam's ledger I placed on the mantel as testament to the past, and all the diaries and photographs I gathered in a wooden chest. I wrapped them in cloth and paper, inscribing across in my own hand, "Memory with boundary. Do not disturb unless remembrance needs release." I left the chest on the parlor floor, near the fireplace, and lit one candle beside it, letting the flame flicker in quiet vigil. I realized then that inheritance was not land, not debt, it was choice. I could choose to carry grief or to transform it. The Halbert covenant had attempted to erase their dead from rest, but I chose to bring rest. The house, at last, had a breath that wasn't silenced by sorrow. I stood in the hallway, sunlight from open windows spilling over polished floors and portraits now realigned to face the outdoor graves, and I silently spoke the final words I had written in the covenant's margin. Memory is sacred. May your sleep be honored. Then I walked out the front door, locking it behind me, stepping onto gravel driveway with the first feeling in years of air that wasn't burdened but open with promise, with release. And I left not with fear, but with hope and conviction that some inheritances are not a property but purpose, and that by choosing rest over ritual, I had given the Halbert family not just graves, but grace, not just stones, but solace, and that the story they left behind was one of broken covenant redeemed, of grief transformed, and of love finally allowed to rest in peace.